Welcome back, everybody. It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. Super excited for this one. It's one I try and do every year, especially as we get really close into draft season. And it's just a video going over about 10 tips and tricks that I have for you guys, specifically in auction drafts. So auction drafts for me are one of the most fun things about fantasy football. I got into them, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, and I've really just sort of fallen in love with it. It makes snake drafts almost a little bit boring to me now, just because auction drafts are so much fun. I think they're a lot more difficult, a lot more challenging as well, and it makes it often a bit of a barrier to entry for some people, as people just aren't really willing to switch over to that format because it's a little intimidating, it's scary. It requires a little bit more research. I think there's a lot more that can go wrong in an auction draft, along with a lot more that can go right if you do it well. So it's a lot of fun. It's really important to make sure that you're prepared and know how to handle it. And hopefully you guys find these tips and tricks useful. I'll try and relate these to players relative to this year as well. But generally this is going to be something that you could look back on in future years as well. Yeah, should be a lot of fun. And if you have any additional tips and tricks you guys want to provide, I love seeing all the comments you guys put, trying to work together there. Hopefully we can come up with a really good list and help each other out and hopefully dominate some auction drafts this year. So let's get into it here. So the first tip I like to give everyone, and this honestly applies to snake drafts as well, but it becomes really, really important when you're in an auction draft, is just really making sure that you understand how tiers work. There's a lot of reasons why tiers are incredibly important. For starters, you just need to understand where the positional drop-offs are, understand that like for example, we've got a very clear tier 1 at tight end, right? You've got Trey McBride, Brock Bowers. If you want to put George Kittle in there, you can. But after that, there's a very clear drop off there, and understanding that is really going to help give you an advantage in your drafts. One thing I typically see during auction drafts is that you'll often see the last player in a tier, especially those tiers where it's really clear who those players in that tier are. You'll generally see that last one go for a lot more than the one being nominated first. That's just because, for example, maybe you go into your auction draft and you're like, hey, I'm going to leave this draft with a tier 1 running back, right? And let's just say the entire league, generally has the consensus that those tier 1 running backs are Saquon, Bijan, and Jahmyr Gibbs. Whatever order you want to put it in, when you get to that third one being nominated, anyone that went into their draft with the intention of leaving with one of those players, they're going to be willing to overpay because there's not a fallback option there. Like, they're not going to be waiting for somebody else. So just being aware of that, I generally find that you'll get the better values from the guys earlier on in the tier. I think it's also really important just to go into your draft with tier-based rankings. I also like to associate each of those tiers with like a max value I'd be willing to bid on those players, and that way I can understand if any player in that tier becomes a value, I'm going to make sure that I get them, and if they don't, then I'm going to be willing to move on. So you don't necessarily have to have your own exact tier, pre-draft values, but just make sure you keep track of it. I think it's going to be really great to do that. And honestly, I think a lot of people they get too linear with it. They don't think about tier-based rankings and all that very well. And I think it's actually a really important factor there. So make sure you do that definitely. Another tip I like to give is just a bid on every player. The main reason for this really is just because it keeps you engaged during the entire draft. I can't tell you how many times I've been in auction drafts where I see at some point during the draft a player just go for far below what the consensus value of that would be. And that's just because you often have, like, it kind of turns into a game of chicken, for example. Like, maybe there's a player that people aren't super high on, but, he's still going to be a good value. A couple people bid a few dollars on this guy, and then nobody really wants to be the one to bid on him, and then he ends up going for super cheap. And making sure that you're consistently engaged in bidding on players is just going to make sure that when those values happen in the draft, they're values that benefit you instead of benefit someone else in your league. You really, like, in a snake draft, you can sort of fall asleep at the wheel, go get a sandwich, come back 20 minutes later, it's your pick, you make your pick, you leave, come back 15 minutes later. And a lot of people kind of take that same approach with auction drafts a little bit. They'll just sort of, drink their beer, look around, have conversation, and not really pay attention unless a specific player comes up that they've been interested in. And because enough people in your league do that, there are going to be players that go for way less than they should. And I think it's just really important to make sure that you're always engaged there. I like to go into my drafts with a general idea of how much I'm willing to spend on every single player, and that includes players that I don't find myself drafting very often because, every player is a good value at the right price tag, right? So even if there's a player that you don't find yourself drafting, just have a value that you'd be willing to bid on them, just because if you have that in mind, it'll make sure that if everyone else in the league likes them less than you or is just not paying attention, you'll still get a good value on that player. So I've seen a recommendation to always bid up to 50% of the pre-draft value. I don't hate that as like a baseline recommendation. So just every player, even if you hate them, 50% probably going to be a good value. But I don't love pre-draft values in general. I like going in with my own list, but if you just want to sort of be a little bit less intense about it and fall back on something like that, I think you could do that. It's not a bad suggestion. The next one here is going to be something that I would recommend for auction and snake draft, but it becomes especially important during an auction draft. That's going to be to play with different builds, just sort of play around with different teams that you can make, especially in an auction draft. The possibilities really are endless. Like you can have any team you want within the constraints of whatever your budget is. And I think something that I personally recommend doing is just sort of building out what your like perfect team would be for each build type. So that ends up being like a hero running back build, a zero running back build, a build where you go quarterback early, maybe a build where you go tight end early, maybe a build where you draft two running backs in the first and second round. You could even go like, what does your team look like if you want to go with like Saquon and Bijan? Stuff like that. Play around with all of those builds. Look at pre-draft values as like a general guideline for what you can maybe expect to be getting these players for on on whatever platform you're drafting at. And when you do this, if you build out like an optimal build for each different build type you have, just have that like readily available to you. One, you can sort of just see which of the build types you like the most. It's really a great way of seeing which different build you think is going to be best for you this season, because it's going to be different every single year just based off of how the values and all that shake out. It might be different between you and me as well. We might just see things differently, but just seeing what the best we can do with each build type, I think it's really a fun exercise to see what we want to pursue. And then what also that does for you is that it's going to give you like, you'll have a hero running back build, a zero running back build, quarterback early build. You'll have like that roster basically listed in front of you. And along with like a list of how much you paid for those guys in that theoretical build. And what that does for you is over the course of your draft, you can sort of see like, okay, maybe you don't have a running back through the first three picks, right? Go take a look at your zero running back build and say, okay, hey, I've done this before. I can follow that mold and really help myself get a really good squad. And just having that little comfort of like seeing the roster that you've built before, seeing how it can play out in your actual draft, it's a good way to reset yourself and also just sort of keep yourself on track. So I love doing it. It's a great practice, great exercise, really fun to see what you can do with an auction draft. And it's also just going to be something you can look at during your draft to sort of help see which different build you want to go towards based off of how things are going out. Another recommendation that, of course, applies to both snake and auction drafts is going to be to just really understand your league. Every single league is different, but in general, you're going to notice some trends in your league, especially if it's a league that you've been in for several years. For example, in my home league, quarterbacks consistently go for far more than their pre-draft value. That's been an advantage for me, honestly, because I've been able to see that trend over the course of my league. And that means that, once you get to the quarterback 12, 13 or whatever, like those quarterbacks are not going for a whole lot because nobody's going to overpay for a backup quarterback. But the top tier quarterbacks, the guys that everyone really likes, those guys go for really expensive in my home league. And what that generally pushes me towards is going towards like a later round quarterback build. And it lets me get a lot of value at all the other positions. Understanding just how your league's going to be different there. It's a really good way to just sort of analyze and understand what you could expect, because obviously, again, pre-draft values, they're a guideline, but things are not just going to go chalk the way they would in like an auction draft with a bunch of computers. You're obviously drafting with 9 or 11 real people that are going to have strong opinions, and it's going to result in some really different draft costs on draft night than maybe what you've seen in your auction draft. So go look at some of the draft summaries from previous years. See if there are any trends that pop out. Like I mentioned, quarterback in my league goes expensive. The same thing's generally for tight ends. Another thing you can do is you can look and just say like the top 5 running backs, how much did those cost? Compare that to how much they're going for this year. Just see if you should expect any sort of deviations there, and being able to be prepared for that and understand how that's going to happen ahead of time. It's just going to help keep you from being shocked on draft night, and it's just going to allow you to be prepared for that going into your draft, which will certainly give you a leg up. Another suggestion I like to give everybody is to budget $2 for every bench player. Something that you'll see really commonly on people that are trying to teach people how to draft in an auction draft is they'll say to budget $1 for every bench player. And in general, I think that it's a strong recommendation. Like, you don't want to be putting too much of your assets into your bench, because obviously you don't get fantasy points for what your bench does. But on the flip side, there ends up being a very significant difference between a player that you can get for $2 and a player that you can get for $1. In general, everyone's going to be looking to spend as much of their budget on their starting lineup as possible, right? That makes a lot of sense. Everyone understands that you're getting your fantasy points from your starting lineup. And what that means is that you generally get towards the end of the draft, and people are very frequently going to only have that $1 for their bet for each bench player. And what that means is that if you have $2 per bench player, then you could actually be an active drafter during those rounds as to where, let's say you're stuck on $1 per player, you only get a player if you can nominate him for $1 and nobody has money to stop you. So it just puts you in a bit of a pickle. You end up basically getting the guys that would be drafted at the very end of the draft to fill out your bench, and that puts you in a bit of a pickle because you are effectively rolling with like 17th or 18th round picks as your entire bench, and that generally is not going to give you a whole lot of depth over the course of the season. There's a huge difference between a guy that you can get for $2 and $1. Of course, the hit rate on these guys, even for $2 guys, it's not great, but just trust me, it's a lot better on those $2 assets. That also just it just gives you a lot more flexibility to get the players that you want. Like, it sucks when you have $1 for your entire bench and you're through, 8 rounds in the draft and you're just like sitting there for the next half hour with no power to do anything except hope you can nominate a player and nobody takes him. It's just a bad spot to be in. I personally don't end up liking my teams very much when I do that because I end up with a bunch of bench players that I'm not excited about. So it's just not something that I personally enjoy doing. I am willing to be flexible on it, especially as I get later on. Like, if I have one flex spot left that I want to fill with my starting lineup, and if going over, like, if spending a couple of extra dollars on him, make sure that I get him on my roster, sends me to like $1 for 3 or 4 of my bench players, $2 for the other 3 or 4. I'm okay doing that as long as I have a good reason, but I think in general, just putting yourself in a spot where you only have $1 per bench player is a recipe for being upset. The one caveat here, if you're in a smaller league, if you're in like an 8-team league, maybe like smaller rostered 10-team leagues, I do sort of shift a little bit towards being a little bit more pro $1 per bench player, just because waivers are going to be really good on those leagues, and it's going to be okay if you have a rough bench to start the year because you'll be able to fill that out early on and over the course of the season. The next tip, and one that I certainly prescribe to, is going to be just to not worry too much about pre-draft value. Of course, this is a guide. It's going to be something that's going to influence what your league mates are valuing, and it's probably going to sort of subconsciously influence you during the course of your draft as well. But in general, they're kind of garbage. Just from platform to platform, there's a ton of variation. They're presented without context. They often contradict the ADPs on the platforms that they're going on. Like, just if you go look at the list of players that show up during your draft, during an auction draft, they're listed in ADP order, and they certainly are not listed in ascending or descending order for pre-draft value. So there's just a very clear disconnect there, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't make sense to be too caught up in it. There's going to be a lot of things that are just don't make any sense relative to the pre-draft values here, and part of that's just because the auction format itself is a whole lot less popular than those just the standard snake drafts. It means that there's just a lot more time and effort put into it from industry in general, making sure that they get those values right relative to getting ADP right. So I think there's a lot of variation in there. I'll go into that later on this offseason as well, just talking about where all those variations are from platform to platform, but it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to really be too caught up on it. It gets really critical, of course, during the middle of a draft as well. If you have a lot of money left, let's say you've gotten your 2 studs, you've got a bit less than half of your money left, and you've been waiting until these middle rounds, and now you're getting to like the bottom of like these tier 2, tier 3 guys, or maybe even lower. It becomes very clear at times that you need to overpay on a player to get him on your roster, rather than just keeping it and ending the draft with a bunch of money to spend on. I have personally, and will certainly do it again at some point this year, I've definitely spent $25, $30 on a player that's supposed to go for 10 to 15 in an auction draft, just because you get to that point where they're the last player to tier, you have the money left, it doesn't make sense to hold it and wait for something else, and just be willing to overpay like crazy because it's still the best thing you can do for your team. In general, I do still recommend sort of making your own pre-draft values. Of course, those are also presented without context. You need to make sure that you're adjusting to how your draft is going, but like, it's just really important to understand that the pre-draft value in front of you on your screen is not really something that's valuable. I've personally at least looked into seeing if we could just remove showing a pre-draft value during the draft because I don't really like them, but they're there. They're going to influence what people are doing, and it's just important to make sure that you are able to take advantage of that. If there's a player, like I think Joe Mixon on ESPN right now is going for like $15 to $20 less than the running backs that are being drafted like one spot next to him. That's going to make Joe Mixon a value on draft night if you're in an auction draft, just because the platform is being dumb. So just make sure that you keep that in mind. It's going to give you a lot of value. I also recommend just making sure you take a look at what the pre-draft values are on all of the platforms and then see where the different largest differences are. So that way you can see, like, like I said, Joe Mixon, great value on ESPN. Go look at Sleeper. I think David Montgomery is a great value right now. Like it's just going to be a you want to make sure that you're looking at each of the platforms and understanding where the value is on your platform so that you can take advantage of that while your league mates won't. The next tip is another really important one, and it's going to be to be intentional about who you nominate. You actually have a lot of power during your auction draft when you're choosing to nominate a player. There are a lot of different ways to utilize that power as well. One option, and it's a really common one, is just to nominate players you don't want because that gets your league mates poorer before a player that you're interested in goes off the board. A key example, say you take Josh Allen early on, it's probably in your best interest to make sure that you're getting Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson all nominated because you're certainly not going to spend money on them, but getting your league mates to spend their money on them, it's just going to get less money available during the course of the draft without taking away a player that you were considering drafting. So that's a really common thing to do. Another approach I like is to just sort of try and give myself information earlier in the draft and where I'd be able to get that in a snake draft. And what I mean by that is, for example, say you are a huge fan of like the tier 3 of quarterback this year, right? You want either Bo Nix, Baker Mayfield, or Kyler Murray, which is kind of where I'm at actually. I'm a big fan of all three of those guys this season. But typically, you wouldn't know you're going to get either one of those three players until you get to like round 7 or 8 or 9 in your draft. And that puts you in a spot where, let's say you get to round 7, you don't want to take them there, and then suddenly all three of those guys get drafted back to back to back round 7 and 8 before you get to your next pick. And now you've missed out on all of the tier 1 guys, and you also aren't going to get any of the guys you wanted there. So a way to do that is like, let's say you really want Kyler Murray, for example. Maybe your second nomination, you just put Kyler Murray up. And what that does for you is you will know basically like what would have been like, it'd be like knowing 5 rounds earlier in a snake draft that you're guaranteed to get that player later. And it just gives you a lot of optionality throughout the draft, knowing where those draft picks are going to come from. So I do kind of like to nominate players a little bit early that I'm specifically targeting. You do typically see them go for a little bit more expensive than what they would have if they were drafted there, but that's just because a lot of people have money, of course, but they also are pretty immune to like those huge bidding wars when you nominate them early, just because nobody feels desperate enough to go after them. So maybe you spend an extra dollar or two on that player, but it gives you the information that you're going to get them way earlier than you would have had that, and it's going to really help you just sort of plan out how you're going to build your roster. So I like doing that. There's a lot of other things you can do there, but the biggest thing is just be intentional about who you're nominating. Don't just put up the next highest guy in ADP. That's not going to benefit you necessarily. It's kind of lazy. Your league mates are certainly going to do it, and just taking advantage of the optionality that the platform's giving you is another way that you can give yourself a leg up in your drafts. So you definitely want to take advantage of that. This one might be the most important. It's going to be just not to draft scared. There's a lot more room to completely screw up an auction draft than there is in a snake draft. For me, that's part of what makes it fun. Like, in general, in a snake draft, you could auto-draft a snake draft, and your team's probably going to turn out okay, but that's not the case in an auction draft in general. And I think part of that is what ends up scaring people into being really passive early in their drafts. I can speak from personal experience here that in my very first ever real auction draft, I didn't have a player on my roster until like the 25th nomination. So I basically went the first and second round without a draft pick. I ended up with a pretty mediocre roster, a lot of mediocre players. I didn't have any superstars, and that's just because I was scared to blow my money early on in the draft. And it was a really quick learning experience for me because I missed out on a lot of studs, and it puts you in a tough spot if you don't have those guys. The worst thing you can do in an auction draft is leave it with a ton of auction budget left over. If you've got a standard $200 budget, you end the draft with like $50. That's about how much like a first round pick would go for. So it'd be like the equivalent of tearing your first round draft pick's ACL, and it's your fault. Nothing happened there. It's just you burnt a first round pick because you didn't spend that value. So it really is that possible to screw up an auction draft there. And I think that if you're going to make a mistake, it's a lot more forgiving to overpay for studs early than it is to sit and wait too long. For me, last year actually in my home league, kind of was pretty in on Saquon Barkley, but was feeling a little nervous about it. Didn't really want to overpay for him, but I wanted to leave the draft with a top tier running back. I overpaid for Saquon Barkley by like $10 or $15 in that draft, and it ended up being a huge benefit for me, obviously. I know it's not always going to work out like that with Saquon or things going your way, but like had I not done that, I'd have ended up with like a couple of mediocre players. I think Rashad White was like the next best available thing, and like it just would have really quickly sunk the overall quality of my roster. And just having those studs is something that's going to give you a huge leg up. So if you're going to screw up, overpay early. Don't just sit on your money the entire draft. And in general, you're going to see people be scared early on. It's really common for me to like see the very first player nominated go for way less than he should. Like number one overall pick by ADP typically ends up not being the most expensive draft pick. So it's almost the cheapest it's ever going to be to get the 101 if you're in an auction draft, because people are typically a little bit scared there. So it's a lot of fun. Have fun with it. Don't be scared. It's definitely going to help you. And the last tip I'm going to give you guys is probably an obvious one, but I'm just going to say it, and it's going to be to practice. Auction drafts are really hard, as are snake drafts, honestly, but I personally would recommend spending a lot more time preparing for your draft than you would for a snake draft, assuming you're doing an auction draft here. There's just a lot more that can go wrong. There's a lot of moving parts. Again, you're actually engaged for what ends up being a much longer draft. It's going to be like a 2 or 3 hour draft instead of like a typical like 45-minute to an hour long draft. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of sort of surprises. You're going to see a player that you thought was going to go for $10 go for 30. You're going to see the opposite happen at some point too. There's just going to be a lot of things that are sort of going to shake out, and unless you've practiced and you're going into it understanding how to handle every single situation, you're going to find yourself in a spot where you feel a little bit unprepared, and it's going to be really easy to tilt and fall apart, especially in an auction draft where there's just so much that can happen there. So in general, anything, you're going to be more advantaged if you're prepared, if you've practiced, if you've put time into it. Auction drafts are the same way. It's also a lot of fun just doing auction drafts, doing mock drafts like that. I personally enjoy doing it, so it's not like it's work or anything. It's just a lot of fun to do, and I think you guys will have a lot of fun with it as well. So highly recommend practicing. It's just going to benefit you a lot, and it's going to really hurt you if you don't practice, because there are going to be a lot of managers in your league that did, and you're going to feel a little lost. So that'll do it for my 10 auction drafts and tips and tricks that are going to help you win your league this year. Hopefully you guys found this video useful. I try and refresh this one every single year. I love auction drafts. I find that there's generally not enough good content out there about auction drafts as well. So that's part of why I'm making it. It's just because it seems like it's really difficult to find anything useful. Like even like all the major platforms, I feel like the pre-draft values are garbage. All the major industry people, they don't really talk about auction drafts a whole lot. I think everyone knows they're fun, but nobody really talks about them just because they're not really mainstream. But if you're in one, that makes it really difficult to find good information. So hopefully you guys found this useful. I'm going to do a lot more auction draft content coming up as well. Talk about auction draft strategies. I'll talk about different advantages on different platforms and stuff, and just really try and get you guys as locked in and stuff for your auction drafts and any of your other drafts as possible. If you haven't subscribed already, I do highly recommend that you do. There are going to be at least 3 videos a week. Honestly, there's going to be a lot more over the next several weeks, several months, because we got a lot of stuff to cover in the next 2 months here before you guys, or a month and a half at this point, before the NFL season kicks off. 2 weeks from today, we got the Hall of Fame game, so football is going to come around closer than you think, and I'm going to be here all off season and all season long to help you guys win your leagues. It's going to be a lot of fun, so just subscribe, stick around. We're going to win some championships together, and we're going to have a lot of fun. So yeah, appreciate you guys. If you made it this far in the video, give it a thumbs up. Hopefully you found it useful. If you have any other auction tips or comments, let me know in the comments below. I love interacting with you guys. It's just a lot of fun, and yeah, good luck, guys. Catch you with the next one. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.